Hello, and welcome back to our series where we are creating a people and culture management system. This series is brought to you by Prairie HR Solutions, and my name is Jake Finger, Principal Consultant here at Prairie HR Solutions. And in this video, I want to carry on with where we left off in our last video. And in our last video, we created a modal that would populate once our drop-down boxes were created and filled. So we created this piece right here, and this button, let me comment this piece out here and I'll show you exactly what this piece did. There's a button that populates that we may or may not need depending on the situation. And as you can see, I added in quite a bit of information. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, please go back and watch my previous videos where we created this modal. But what we did was we populated this dynamically by getting the records notification body and the title, and then set the inner text to what it is that we wanted. And I want to show the difference between inner text and inner HTML, because right now with inner text, it is only showing everything in between these quotation marks as text. And you'll see that there are HTML tags in here, but they're not going to render because we have it set to inner text. It's just going to show straight up as text. So let's go ahead and show this here. I'll show you exactly what it's going to render as, simply because we have it set at inner text. So it populates as normal, but you'll see that the tags are being rendered as text, and we don't want that. We want the tags to be picked up as HTML and then rendered as HTML. And then we also want to change this button here, or this little X, to be white in the background there. And then we also want to do something with this button. This button is going to come in handy if we need the user to acknowledge something, such as, yes, I am retrieving the record prior to updating the record. And then they would press acknowledge to finish running the code. But we don't need this button all the time. So we need to hide or set the display of this button to none, which would hide it, or block if we wanted to show it. And the other thing that I'd like to do is notice how we're having to scroll the whole thing down to read this thing. And, we don't necessarily want that. We would like to just be able to scroll this inner body here. So those are the things that I'd like to work on in this video. So let's come back here and let's handle that button first. So we handled that button simply by removing it. And that works, obviously. Save it and let's refresh this. It's removing the entire button. So if we never really needed this button, that would work. If we did it this way, however, there would be some interesting things that we would have to address, particularly when the DOM content loaded, which is when this runs. This show subcategory block runs based on a selection from this compliance reporting and records. And sometimes when you refresh a page, to ensure that the page runs quicker than it does initially, let's see, I guess I can put it in a way that it's going to take shortcuts and try to make the page run as fast as possible. And with this being removed, it tends to throw things for a loop. And what I mean by that is sometimes it will keep it removed And in order to make sure it runs consistently all the time and shows that if we need it, we would end up having to recreate this button as essentially a parent and child node. So we're not going to do that. That's too complex. If we needed to do it repeatedly or more than once, that's one thing, but we only need it to show at one time. So we're just going to hide it. So let's just go ahead and delete this whole line. And instead of using the remove method to remove it, we'll just simply hide it. But remove does come in handy if you're doing things over and over or sending things to a helper function. Then you can remove, set, create element or whatnot, but we'll just hide it. We'll just set it to none. So there's the button piece. Now let's go take care of our button close. Now this button close is that X up in the top right hand corner. And with Bootstrap, since we're using Bootstrap probably already handled this within this class. And if not, we can go in and do some CSS. But let's go over to our Bootstrap page here and see if they've handled this in some way, shape, or form. So what we'll look for is a button, because even though that's an X, it's still essentially a button. So let's scroll down here and look at their CSS piece here and see what the button is going to do, how we can change that. So we have button, let's see, we have this piece right here, which is our button close. That's not really what we're looking for. Okay, let's look at our modal. Okay, so let's go back to our button. We'll just have to create something. So it's going to be this button, obviously. And it looks like the button can extend out. So if we were to identify the button close, oh, there it is right there. Look at that close button. Oh, yep, that's it right there. Okay. So button close, dark variant. So yeah, so we can actually just go in here and do button close and then a color, it looks like. So yeah, let's go ahead and add in button close, and then since it appears that they use white here, we'll just do button close white. So that should take care of the button. And then let's look at the modal and how we can scroll it. Right now we are using this static backdrop. But what we're wanting to do is, that's the default. That's what we have going on right now, and we don't want that. We're actually wanting to, there it is, scroll the inside body. Good, I'm glad they have that because that would be a pain to do. And it looks like all we do is add this modal dialogues scrollable thing to the class. Okay, so let's go back and change those two things here. So here's this button close. So this was button close, and let's just do white. And then our scroll was on our dialog. Scrollable. Okay, good. So now that should take care of that. Let's come over here and refresh our page. and see what that did. Okay, good. So it's scrollable, but that's not white. Okay, so let's go back and see what we can do here. Button, oh, yep. And that's the reason. Added just a random letter in there. Okay, so now let's check it. Added a random letter and had no idea what I was talking about. Okay, yep, that'll work. Maybe we can go back a little bit later on and brighten that up, but that's their version of white. Looks like it might be set to a transparent and kind of picking up some of the background, but yeah, we can fix with that. It's better than it was. So now let's take a look at our text here. So we have it set as inner text. So it's not rendering or identifying these HTML tags as anything other than text. So let's come back over to our code here and let's change this to, or from inner text to inner HTML. And what this is going to do is this is going to populate as text, but then when it gets to a HTML tag, it's then going to render this as HTML and then continue on rendering the words here as text. And then every time it hits an HTML tag, it's going to render it as HTML. So let's save this and see what difference that makes. And there you go. It's rendering it all as HTML. Perfect. Perfect. So now let's take care of this button and do something else. Because up to this point, we are essentially creating all the text inside whatever function it is that we're running it. So this takes up quite a bit of space within this function. So what we could do is we could create a function to kind of cut this down a little bit, sort of like we did with some of our clearing, our reset form function. We can kind of do something similar to that. And that way we're not actually having to call our document, set the inner text, inner HTML, and as well as taking care of that button. So let's come up here and actually create that function. And what we could do is call this function, let's call this function show modal, not mode, modal. There we go. Yep, that's what it is, show modal. That'll work. So what we're going to do is now set a few variables. Let's create a constant variable and let's call this one modal title. Do that equal to, and this modal title is going to be equal to this because we need to set our focus on that. We don't need to worry about setting it to inner text yet. And then let's create the body. Let's just call this modal body. And this is going to be equal to this. And then let's create the button. Let's just call this the acknowledge. Acknowledge button will work. And that is going to be equal to, nope, we deleted it, so I'll have to get it again. Document dot get element by ID. And the button was record acknowledge button? I don't know. Let's go back and look at it just to make sure. Yep, it's this one. Record acknowledge button. Okay, so let's put that in there like so. And then there's that. So now what we can do with this function here is we can send the title that we want and the body that we want to this function as parameters, or essentially as arguments. So we could send these over, and let's call the title, let's just be very obvious, let's call the title. Since it's a function, we need to separate it with a comma and a space. Don't forget the space. And the next one is going to be the body content. And then the third one that we're going to want to do is handle that acknowledge button. And we'll use the word button here. And this acknowledge button, what we're going to end up having to do is check to see if it's required or not. So how we can do that is simply by setting a default to true. So true is obviously going to mean that, yes, this is needed. And how we can check this is with an if statement. But we also need to ensure that the main title and the main body is set to inner text or inner HTML, as well as assigning it whatever's coming over in these two arguments. So let's do that first before we tackle that acknowledge button. So let's create a comment here, and this is going to be set the title and body dynamically. That'll work. So we need to take the modal title, and this is going to be inner text. And that inner text is going to be whatever is coming over and being called this title. And then we need to do the same thing to the modal body. But the modal body is not going to be inner text. It's going to be inner HTML. And that is going to be equal to the body content argument, whatever's coming over here and that. So now let's focus on that button. So what we want to do essentially is check if the acknowledge button even exists before trying to modify it. And remember, when we do an if statement, what we're checking inside these parentheses is for a true value. So if we're not really trying to find, say, the answer to an equation, like if a variable is less than 1, we're not trying to find out the value of that. We're just trying to figure out if that statement is true or false. Well, we already know it's going to be true or false because we're going to pass it right here. So let's just simply say acknowledge button, and the button is there. It's true, right? It's present. And then if it is present, what we are going to do is simply check to see this acknowledge button is true or false. And the reason I'm doing it in a nested piece, and a nested piece like this, is because if we say we were to remove it in the future or whatnot, or we just want to completely get rid of it until we need it, this allows us to check to see if it exists. Because like I said, once that DOM reloads, it may or may not pick up that remove because it's trying to handle its processes as quickly as possible. Now, if a person was to close a browser and then reopen it, it would pick it up. But if the browser is already open and we simply hit refresh, or we go back and go and do something like in the compliance records or the compliance reports and then come back to the body, it's going to render that pop-up, but because it's trying to handle things that it's already done efficiently, it may or may not realize that it needs to reset that button unless we go in and actually create it again. So to keep things simple, we're just going to check to see if it exists for now, and that will take care of any of the future add-ons or instances that we have. So once it is true that it exists, we're going to check that acknowledge button. Now remember, we're checking to see if it's true or false. So by default, it's true. And if it is true, we are going to want to take this acknowledge button and this should not be record acknowledge button. I apologize. That should just be acknowledge button. I was thinking of something completely different. So we're going to grab this acknowledge button here, this variable, and we are going to set the style display simply to block, which means that it is showing and it takes up space. And what we're going to want to do if that comes back false is set our acknowledge style display to none. So now let's make sure that we have all of our curly brackets set. This should be the first if. Okay, and then after all this is run, we are obviously going to want to show the modal. And that is simply this. Okay, let's save this. And now let's come back down here and let's go ahead and comment this out for now. And instead of having to type this whole piece out, we can simply call this show modal with these parameters. Now we don't have to call it a parameter because whatever is going to be passed to the function when we call it is going to be that data. So I'll show you what I mean here. So let's come down here and we will type in show modal. Now this show modal is going to take an argument, 3 of them actually. And that first argument is going to simply be our title. So the first argument will always align with the first argument of the function. We're just calling that the value and the data coming over as title so we can reference it. Now we're going to need to separate it. And then the next one is the body content, which we're setting as HTML. And then the one after that is going to be our record acknowledge button right here. Now it's default to true, and this isn't going to be anything other than true or false, honestly. And what we're wanting it to be in this case is false. So now let's go ahead and save this and see what we got, see if we made any errors, typos or whatnot. Hopefully we didn't, but we'll see. If we did, we'll address them. So let's refresh this and come down, operations, records. Okay, good. So now we don't need that button, and that button disappeared, and it is populating our title, and it is populating our body. So now let's go back and try it with true. So we know we're setting it to false because we're like, we don't need that button. We don't want that button. Now let's set it to true in case we did need that button. We'll save it and refresh it. Okay, refresh the page, operations, records, and as you can see, that button is now reappearing. So instead of removing it and then relying on the DOM to go through the whole process instead of shortcutting it for speed purposes, we are just leaving it there, just setting it to block and none. So good. So now we have that built in dynamically. And what we can do is instead of having, this whole piece, we can now just send it to a function. And what's great about this is I know it's still taking up quite a bit, not as much, but it assists with readability, and our notifications are not going to be this long, and we're not having to call the document get element by IDs all the time and then manually go through and set the inner text, inner HTML every single time that we need a notification or an alert box. We can simply just call this and then pass these three parameters to it and just be done with it. So that's how you create a dynamic populated modal. And in the next video, I think what we will do is come back and work on styling. I think we're pretty much done with our functionality of our create, read, update, and archive function. And really now what I'd like to do is show you how to change the colors and the layout, because I know we've been using Prairie HR Solutions branding colors. And I know that each individual company or preference or whatever has different color schemes in mind. So we're going to change this up a little bit, and I'll show you how to do that within CSS. And then this should take care of our records management piece. And then we'll be able to go into, do some actual analytics, compensation, maybe some graphs, more tables, and things like that. So if you like what we're doing, please hit that subscribe button. Let us know to continue on. If you do have any ideas or requests on us putting together something else, maybe specifically on HTML or CSS, just send us an email. Our email is in the description box. And until next time, please take care.